Africa stands at a crossroads. One man, Ibrahim Traoré, has dared to challenge expectations, to step into the shadows of power, and to forge a partnership with one of the wealthiest men on earth, Bill Gates. What began as whispers of an alliance has now become a story of mystery, ambition, and a bold attempt to reshape the future of an entire continent. In this video, we dive deep into the dramatic, cinematic journey of Traoré's rise, the hidden threats, and the shocking moves that changed Africa forever. From hunger and despair to technology and hope, witness how a single leader turned a potentially dangerous alliance into a symbol of empowerment. If you enjoy cinematic stories that uncover secrets, suspense, and the courage to defy the odds, make sure to hit like, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more gripping stories from around the world. Under the choking heat of the Sahel sun, a rumor began to coil itself around Africa like smoke. Murmurs of an impossible meeting. Whispers that Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier who rose from dusty barracks to the presidency of Burkina Faso, had stepped into a pact with one of the most powerful men on earth, Bill Gates. The rumor did not drift from idle tongues. It bled through the corridors of embassies, was scribbled in secret cables, and carried by men in sharp suits who spoke in hushed tones. Something strange was happening, and Africa trembled in anticipation. At first, no one believed it. Traoré, the face of defiance, the man who declared Africa would not bow to colonial chains, how could he walk into the shadow of the West's wealthiest figure? Yet the world had learned not to underestimate the gravity of desperation. Hunger gnawed at villages. Fields once rich with millet lay cracked and barren. Mothers rocked lifeless children under withered trees. The fragile state of Burkina Faso was but a mirror of the continent's suffering. Hope was running thin, and even the most iron-hearted leader was forced to look for answers in places he once swore to reject. But this alliance, this whisper of a meeting, was no ordinary negotiation. They said it happened under the veil of night, far from the eyes of the people. Gates arrived not as a philanthropist with cameras flashing, but as a shadow, cloaked in silence, his private jet touching down on African soil like a ghost. He carried promises of medicine that could wipe out plagues, seeds that could bloom in desert sands, and devices that could harness power from thin air. Yet no gift from the powerful comes without a price, and the question stalked every whispered conversation. What would Africa owe in return? Traoré's enemies seized upon the rumor. "He is selling us to the West," they murmured in the streets. Old revolutionaries spit curses, recalling the legacy of Sankara, who had fought and died resisting foreign control. Young soldiers, hungry and restless, wondered if their captain was betraying them for riches and prestige. The air was heavy with suspicion. The IMF's chains still clinked at the edges of every debate, and now it seemed another master was arriving through the back door. Yet for Traoré, this was no matter of loyalty or betrayal. It was survival. In the silence of his chambers, beneath the low hum of a flickering bulb, he studied the proposals laid before him. The documents were thick with clauses and codes, words buried in fine print that could twist the fate of nations. Gates spoke of a future where Africa would leap ahead, where starvation and disease would fall to science. But hidden inside those promises, Traoré could feel a chill. Why had so many who questioned the alliance vanished without a trace? Why did some farmers report seeds that grew too fast, too unnaturally, withered in a month, and poisoned the soil? The young leader found himself at a crossroads no soldier had prepared him for. He had walked through gunfire, betrayed coups and foreign sanctions. But this was an invisible war, a battlefield of contracts and codes, where bullets were replaced by patents and shackles came disguised as innovation. The world leaned closer, waiting. Africa's children waited. Even Gates's own circle whispered doubts about the true nature of his obsession with Africa. In the haze of smoke-filled rooms, men in power argued whether Traoré was a naive soldier walking into a trap, or a strategist clever enough to turn the trap into a weapon. Then came the moment that froze history, the night when cameras caught a single image, blurred but unmistakable. Bill Gates and Ibrahim Traoré stepping into the same hall. The world erupted. News outlets screamed betrayal, hope, scandal, conspiracy. Africa held its breath. The West smirked. and the streets of Ouagadougou filled with silence as people whispered only one question. What would Ibrahim Traoré do with this alliance? And who, in the end, would be in control? What he did next shocked the world. The desert night in Burkina Faso held a silence that was heavier than gunfire. The image of Ibrahim Traoré and Bill Gates entering the same hall spread like wildfire across the world, igniting debates that raged in cafes, war rooms, and secret chambers alike. But while the world argued, the soil of Africa told its own truth, cracked, dry, exhausted. Crops refused to grow and the sky gave no rain. Mothers searched for grain in empty markets. Fathers dug into earth with bare hands, and children pressed their ribs against the dust. Famine had become a shadow trailing every household, and disease crept into the cracks that hunger left behind. For Traoré, this crisis was no abstraction. He had stood in those markets, seen the hollow eyes of his people, and listened to the coughs of soldiers too malnourished to lift their rifles. He understood that guns could win battles, but they could not fill empty stomachs. And so he faced the unthinkable, walking into the arms of a man whose very name carried both hope and suspicion. Bill Gates had long been a figure of contradictions in Africa. To some, he was a savior, funding vaccines, schools, and food programs. To others, he was a shadowy manipulator, playing God with crops and medicines, planting innovations that carried invisible chains. His empire was not built from land or armies, but from patents and technology. And now, in the face of Africa's worst crises, he came with offers of salvation. Traoré knew well the legacy he carried. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary once called Africa's Che Guevara, had rejected foreign aid and insisted Africa must feed itself. His assassination decades ago still haunted Burkina Faso like a curse. Every move Traoré made was measured against Sankara's ghost. To accept Gates's help would be to walk against that legacy. To reject it, however, would condemn millions to starvation. He was caught in a vice, where every choice felt like betrayal. Behind closed doors, Gates laid out his vision with the precision of an engineer. He spoke of crops genetically designed to flourish in barren soil, of solar grids capable of powering entire villages, of medical programs that could erase malaria in a generation. The presentations were dazzling, charts and projections glowing across the dimly lit room. But Traoré's eyes were not fixed on the promises. They were locked on the fine print. The contract spoke of control, of exclusive rights, of intellectual property that would place Africa's survival under the lock and key of foreign corporations. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the people whispered their own interpretations. Some believed Traoré was about to sell Burkina Faso's gold for machines that could never be owned. Others whispered that he was cleverer than he seemed, that he would use Gates' power only long enough to build his own strength, then turn the tables. The atmosphere was heavy, every conversation circling back to the same question. Was their leader still theirs? Three figures began to circle the rumor with growing intensity. Presidents of neighboring nations who saw Traoré's alliance as both a threat and an opportunity. They sent emissaries, each carrying veiled warnings. If he chose wrongly, they would not hesitate to step against him. Africa's future, they insisted, could not be negotiated in the shadows of billionaires. And yet, behind their protests lay greed. Some wanted Gates's projects for their own nations. Others feared Traoré's growing influence. Meanwhile, ordinary people bore the weight of choices made in secret. In northern villages, men collapsed under the strain of digging barren soil. Mothers carried dying children to clinics only to be told there was no medicine left. Disease was not waiting for debates in boardrooms. It was spreading. And still, Traoré hesitated. At night, under the dim glow of a single lamp, he pored over the documents again and again. For every promise Gates made, there was a clause hidden beneath it. For every solution, there was a lock. It was not chains of iron they were offering him. It was chains made of paper, invisible and permanent. Yet he also saw something else, a crack in the system. A weakness buried inside the very ambition of Gates's empire. He began to ask questions that unsettled even his closest advisors. Why now? Why Africa? Why had certain diseases flared with such precision in the very nations Gates sought to enter? Why were farmers reporting seeds that grew too perfectly, as if nature had been replaced by machines. The answers were few, but the unease grew deeper. Still, the crisis pressed closer. Famine did not wait for revelations. With every passing day, more lives slipped away. Traoré's soldiers looked to him with hollow eyes. The people looked to him with prayers and curses alike. His decision could no longer be delayed. Then, as if the continent itself conspired to force his hand, Gates returned, not with words, but with proof. A convoy of black trucks rolled into Ouagadougou under the cover of night. Inside were sealed containers holding seeds unlike any Africa had seen before. They said these seeds could grow in deserts, feeding millions with a single harvest. The air around them carried the scent of hope, but also the weight of suspicion. No one knew if they were gifts or weapons. And so the stage was set. A nation dying of hunger, a billionaire with promises too powerful to ignore, and a leader torn between legacy and survival. The alliance loomed over him like a storm on the horizon. His enemies sharpened their knives, his people held their breath, and his allies whispered only one warning: choose wisely, Ibrahim. The world is watching. Night in Ouagadougou no longer felt like night. The city slept in silence, but somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen forces moved like shadows. Ibrahim Traoré knew the convoy of sealed containers was more than just seeds. It was a test, a temptation placed carefully before him. The world had its eyes on Africa, and for the first time in decades, the continent stood at the center of a game it had not chosen to play. The alliance with Bill Gates, though never fully announced, leaked through every crack of power. International news stations painted it in bright colors, a new dawn for Africa. Gates and Traoré's bold experiment, the West meets the Sahel. Yet in the alleys and villages, people whispered darker names: the deal of chains, the seed of death. Farmers prayed over the strange grains, too frightened to plant them, yet too desperate to let them rot. Inside Traoré's compound, tension grew unbearable. Reports piled on his desk like a storm. In one file, photographs of malnourished children, their eyes hollow and their limbs skeletal. In another, whispers of protests breaking out in the capital, where young men carried signs reading, "Burkina will not be sold." His advisors were split, half urging him to take Gates' offer and save lives immediately, the other half begging him to refuse, warning that hidden costs would come later, costs far greater than hunger. It was then that strange accidents began to happen. A journalist who investigated the seed shipments was found dead in a roadside crash, though no tire marks showed skidding. A minister critical of the alliance collapsed suddenly in his office, his lips blue, his papers scattered across the floor. In the north, an entire village reported their wells poisoned overnight, the water stinking of chemicals no one could identify. Traoré could feel the invisible war tightening around him. Meanwhile, rebel groups long dormant began to stir. Armed men crossed borders, spreading chaos in villages where trust in the government was already thin. They carried not only rifles but stories, that Traoré had sold his people's future, that the billionaire's seeds would make the soil barren forever, that Burkina Faso was being turned into a laboratory. These rebels were not working alone. Traoré recognized the fingerprints of foreign influence, old colonial powers using the alliance to ignite fear. The most devastating blow came from within his own circle. 3 of his closest officers, men he had trusted on battlefields, men who had bled beside him, were caught in a secret meeting with foreign agents. Documents seized from their possession revealed plans to destabilize the government, should Traoré refuse to fully surrender control of the Gates alliance. Betrayal had seeped into the very heart of his command, and now every handshake felt like poison. And yet, the suffering outside grew louder. Women lined the hospitals, their babies burning with fever, praying for medicine that no longer existed. Farmers begged for the new seeds, promising they would plant them carefully, that they could not watch their families starve another season. The pressure mounted like a blade against his throat. Every delay meant more death. Every hesitation meant more distrust. Through sleepless nights, Traoré searched for answers hidden between shadows. He ordered samples of the seeds quietly tested by independent scientists in secret laboratories across the continent. The results chilled him. Yes, the seeds could grow where nothing else survived, but they came with sterile locks. Once harvested, they could not be replanted. Farmers would need to return again and again, each season, dependent on the source that created them. It was not salvation. It was a leash. The discovery left him tormented. If he rejected the seeds publicly, the world would paint him as a tyrant who let his people starve out of pride. If he accepted them, he would shackle Burkina Faso, and perhaps all of Africa, into permanent dependency. His enemies circled closer, sensing his hesitation. His allies grew silent, waiting for a sign. And above it all, Gates remained an enigma, smiling quietly in interviews, his words dripping with confidence, his eyes betraying nothing. One evening, as thunder rolled across the dry skies, Traoré sat alone in his war room, the maps of Africa sprawled before him. He traced his finger along borders drawn decades ago by colonial rulers, borders that had split tribes, cut rivers, and carved wounds still bleeding. He thought of Sankara's warnings, of the price of dreams stolen by false promises. He thought of the children he had sworn to protect, their cries echoing in the night. The alliance had become more than a political question. It was a spiritual one. Was he building a future for Africa, or delivering it into the jaws of a new empire, dressed not in uniforms but in lab coats and contracts? The answer, he realized, could not be found in documents or deals. It had to be forged through action, through risk, through defiance. And so Traoré began to plan. Not a rejection, not a surrender, but something else. Something neither Gates nor his enemies could predict. He would take the alliance into his own hands, twist its hidden chains into weapons, and reveal to the world a truth buried beneath the promises. The night carried a heavy silence, but in that silence, a decision was born. A storm was coming, not of rain, but of revelation. What Traoré was about to do would either save his nation or set the entire continent ablaze. The dawn broke over Ouagadougou with a muted light, as if the sun itself were wary of what was to come. Ibrahim Traoré moved through the city with quiet determination, his eyes sharp, scanning for both allies and spies. Every building, every alley, every shadow could conceal a threat or a clue. The seeds and the promises from Gates were not merely tools, they were weapons in disguise. And Traoré now held the map to how they could be turned to Africa's advantage. He summoned his closest advisors into a hidden chamber beneath the presidential palace. The room was thick with tension, the hum of air vents masking the distant cries of a city still roused by hunger. Traoré laid out his plan. He would publicly accept Gates's alliance, yet privately take control of the technologies and supplies. The contracts, the patents, the seeds, all would be scrutinized, rewritten, and redistributed under African authority. Every hand that reached for power over his nation would find itself empty, but executing such a plan required precision. Gates operatives were everywhere, observing, recording, waiting for the first misstep. Traoré had to outthink them, anticipate their moves, and act before whispers of betrayal turned into open conflict. Every decision became a chess piece. Soldiers were redeployed not to fight armies, but to guard laboratories, hospitals, and transport routes. Farmers and villagers were quietly informed of new protocols, educated to use the seeds in ways that ensured independence rather than dependency. The day of the unveiling arrived, broadcast to a world eager for spectacle. Gates stood beside Traoré on a platform gleaming with cameras and lights, his smile calm, almost serene. The world expected a simple story of philanthropy, a billionaire and a young African leader shaking hands while hope and money flowed together. But Traoré's plan unfolded like a slow, deliberate crescendo. As Gates spoke of miracles and progress, Traoré quietly activated the safeguards he had set. The seeds, genetically engineered to require proprietary care, were paired with knowledge transfer to African scientists, ensuring local control. The solar grids and medical programs were already under local management, their codes encrypted and rewritable by Burkina Faso engineers. Every promise that could have been a leash became a tool for liberation. Then came the moment that would mark history. Traoré stepped forward, voice calm but commanding, and revealed the hidden truths of the alliance. The world had assumed Africa would bend to Gates's terms, That dependency was inevitable. Yet Traoré had taken the very instruments of power intended to control and placed them in the hands of the people. The cameras caught the gasp of diplomats, journalists, and even Gates himself. A silent shock rippled across continents. Gates operatives attempted to intervene, but the safeguards made their systems useless. Security protocols denied access. The patents, the seed codes, the databases, all were now controlled by Burkina Faso. The billionaire's calm demeanor faltered for the first time. He had underestimated the young leader who had risen from barracks and battlefields to stand at the center of a global stage. Across the continent, ordinary people felt the shift. Farmers planting seeds for the first time in barren soil watched them sprout with resilience. Villages that had gone months without electricity felt the hum of power from solar grids managed by their own engineers. Hospitals received vaccines and medicines, now distributed under local supervision. The alliance, once a shadow of control, had been transformed into a beacon of empowerment. Yet even in triumph, the shadows lingered. Questions remained. Who else had been watching, plotting? Were there hidden forces beyond Gates's empire, waiting for a crack in Traoré's defenses? Could Africa truly rise, or would new threats emerge from the corners of power unseen? The young leader did not waver. He had faced betrayal, hunger, and suspicion, and now he faced the world with a quiet, unshakable resolve. That day, the world learned something crucial. Ibrahim Traoré was not a man to be manipulated. He could walk into the lion's den and emerge with the mane of his people intact. The alliance had been a gamble, but it became a masterstroke. Africa was no longer merely the backdrop for foreign ambition. It was a player, commanding the narrative, shaping its destiny, and teaching the world a lesson in vigilance, courage, and vision. Traoré stood alone for a moment on the platform after the crowds dispersed, the air thick with expectation and awe. Somewhere in the quiet, he allowed himself the faintest smile. He knew the road ahead would remain treacherous, but for the first time in a long while, he sensed that power, true power, rested where it had always belonged, in the hands of Africa itself. And in that moment, the world realized a simple truth. The alliance had been forged, but not on the terms anyone expected. The days that followed unfolded like the slow, deliberate turning of a page, each one revealing a new chapter in a story the world had not dared imagine. Across Burkina Faso, the streets pulsed with cautious hope. Farmers harvested crops that flourished in soils once thought barren, their hands stained with earth that now bore life instead of despair. Villages that had sat in darkness for decades hummed with the quiet electricity of solar grids managed by local engineers, their screens glowing like embers of a long-awaited dawn. Ibrahim Traoré moved among his people, yet never as a figure of spectacle. He listened to their stories, their laughter, their cautious gratitude. Soldiers who had once doubted him now carried a respect rooted not in fear, but in the knowledge that their leader had gambled everything to secure the future of the nation. Mothers whispered blessings as children played under the glow of newly electrified homes, their smiles piercing through the years of hunger that had shadowed the land. The world outside Burkina Faso took notice. Media outlets, initially skeptical, now chronicled the extraordinary transformation. Headlines shifted from Alliance of Doubt to Africa's New Dawn. Diplomats scrambled to understand how a young leader had wrested control from one of the most powerful men on earth without bloodshed, without war, and yet with unflinching precision. Gates himself offered statements that danced between admiration and disbelief. Acknowledging that Traoré had not merely accepted the alliance, he had rewritten it entirely. But the transformation was not only material, it was symbolic. Across the continent, whispers of what had occurred in Ouagadougou spread like wildfire. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Ghana began to rethink old dependencies, consulting their own scientists and engineers, seeking autonomy rather than submission. The seeds of change planted by Traoré, both literal and metaphorical, ignited movements in towns and cities, where the people began to demand control over their destinies. The alliance that had once carried the weight of suspicion and hidden chains became a beacon of possibility. Gates's technologies, now governed by local councils and African experts, multiplied in impact. Clinics received vaccines, New schools opened, and research centers flourished where laboratories had once been empty. Africa was learning to walk not in the shadow of foreign empires, but in the full light of its own ingenuity. Even within the halls of power, the air shifted. Former critics of Traoré's leadership could no longer deny his vision, nor the results it produced. Enemies who had whispered of betrayal now spoke in terms of cautioned respect. Traoré, however, remained humble, aware that the path ahead was long, the journey far from complete. Every step forward carried responsibility. Every victory demanded vigilance. And yet, despite the optimism, questions lingered, echoes of mystery that refused to fade. Had the world truly been changed, or was this merely the first act of a longer, more complicated story? Could Africa maintain its newfound sovereignty in the face of global powers still seeking influence, still testing boundaries? Traoré did not pretend to have all the answers. He only knew that he had seized a moment and turned it into opportunity. In the quiet of the evening, standing on a balcony overlooking Ouagadougou, he watched the sun set across a land that was waking from decades of struggle. The air smelled of dry earth and promise, of firewood and blossoming hope. Somewhere far away, Gates watched the unfolding of events with an expression that balanced pride and contemplation. Together, intentionally or not, they had created a story that no one would forget. A story of power seized, of destiny rewritten, and of a continent beginning to rise. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, a question lingered, heavy and electric in the air. Is this the moment Africa truly claimed its future? Or merely the first step toward the greatness it was always meant to achieve? For Ibrahim Traoré, the answer was clear in the faces of his people. Hope had returned, tempered by vigilance, fueled by action, and strengthened by the courage to defy expectation. The alliance had not only been forged, it had been transformed, and in its forging, a continent had begun to reclaim its own story. The world had witnessed a leader who dared to bend the rules of power without breaking the spirit of his people. And in that daring, the seeds of Africa's rise were sown,